Hey everyone, in this video what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about the so-called laws of logic, types of logic, as well as some things regarding statements and arguments. Now the reason why we're doing stuff on logic before we get to stuff on ethics is because I think having a little bit of background in logic will give you some vocabulary and some theoretical equipment to be able to critique and analyze some things in ethics more effectively. So let's start by taking a look at the so-called laws of logic.
The first thing I want to talk about is the notion of the so-called laws of logic. Now, when it comes to the history of describing logic in the so-called Western tradition, the first person to really articulate various features of logic with a great kind of specificity was Aristotle, who lived in the 4th century BCE. And so Aristotle identified three fundamental principles of logic. What he means by laws of logic are here's the three fundamental things you have to accept, period. And there's kind of an insinuation here that everybody accepts these. There's no way that you could do any kind of logical reasoning without accepting these principles, these laws. Therefore, everybody believes in them, and that even if you're going to try and refute logic and say, here's how I'm going to disprove logic, you couldn't really do so in any meaningful way without accepting these principles, is what Aristotle is getting at, and his successors. And this is echoed in some other logical traditions in other non-Greek societies as well. You kind of see elements that are like this in, say, the Nyaya Sutras by Akshapada Gautama in India and other places. But here in the Greek tradition is what's most well known in the so-called Western tradition, so that's why I'm going to stick here. And he says these things pretty succinctly and in a threefold way. So here are the three basic laws of logic. The first one is the law of identity, and this one is probably the most simple, and here's what Aristotle means when he says these things are obvious. The law of identity is simply that a thing is the same as itself. What does that mean? It really is as simple as it sounds. So here's a quote from Aristotle's Metaphysics that I have here. Now, to ask why a thing is the same as itself is no question, because when we ask the reason of a thing, the fact must first be evident that, for example, when we say something like the moon suffers an eclipse, and because it is itself, is the one explanation and reason which applies to all questions such as why is a man man, or why is a cultured person cultured. What Aristotle's saying here is that when we have meaningful language, the law of identity is obvious. When I say the moon has an eclipse, what am I talking about? I'm talking about the moon and not something else. So that when we use language, when we refer to, especially nouns, but it could be verbs and adjectives as well. The green pen. What do you mean by green? I mean green, not some other thing, blue or red. When I say pen, I mean pen and not something else. Now sometimes we can agree to talk in like a code, okay, and we'd be like, when I point this green pen here and I say, the blue pen, and maybe blue we're using as a code word for green for some reason. Sometimes this happens. But basically, when we talk about something, we're talking about that thing and not something else. This is and Aristotle says this is an obvious feature of language, that when we're talking, when we're communicating, we mean what we say, and we're referring to the objects that we say that we're referring to, and not some other thing. And he says this is super, super obvious. When I talk about something, I mean what I'm talking about. You have to accept that. You can't just someone say something and go, oh, you must be talking about this other thing. No, they're talking about this, or I'm talking about this. So that's the law of identity. Something is itself and not something else. Water is water. The moon is the moon. I am me. Alright, the next one is the law of non-contradiction. Now this is basically a variation on the same theme. So if the law of identity is true, these other two laws of logic are sort of corollaries. That is to say, they should also be obvious if the law of identity is true. So the law of non-contradiction works this way. A thing cannot both be and not be at the same time and in the same sense. So I'm going to read a little bit of this from Aristotle here, not the whole quotation, but that way you can see the context of where it's coming from. Aristotle says, clearly then, it's a principle of this kind that is the most certain of all principles. Let us next state what this principle is. It is impossible for the same attribute at once to belong and not to belong to the same thing and in the same relation. So something can't both be and not be at the same time and in the same sense. That's a contradiction. Now sometimes we'll use the word contradiction to mean something being inconsistent. So let's say, Bob is a hardworking person, but he's having a lazy day. Well, Bob is both hardworking and lazy, that seems to be a contradiction. Or sometimes we do this with politics. Someone's a Republican, but on this view they're kind of liberal, that's a contradiction. Or someone's a Democrat, but on this point they're conservative, that's a contradiction. That might be inconsistent, but it's not necessarily a contradiction. A contradiction is saying something and then explicitly saying the opposite. Okay, it'd be like me saying, for example, at the time of me doing this, it happens to be Sunday. To say today is Sunday and not Sunday, that's a contradiction. All right, to say something and immediately the exact same thing with a not or a negation in front of it, that's what a contradiction is. But Aristotle qualifies it. He says, at the same time and in the same sense. So something can't both be and not be at the same time in the same sense. So I could say, for example, let's say I'm in a classroom, it's 8 o'clock in the morning, I'm super tired. There's a sense in which I can say, I'm here, but I'm not here. Is that a contradiction? Well, it might look like one at first glance. But what's going on there is probably I'm talking about here in the first sense, meaning my physical presence, and here in the second sense, meaning my mental presence. So I'm talking about two different senses, so that's not a contradiction, even though it may look like one. Or the notion of time. For example, right now I'm in my office, but at other times today, I won't be in my office. So today, on this Sunday, I was in my office, and I was not in my office. That's a contradiction. No, it's not. Okay, because of the notion of time. Something can't both be and not be at the same time in the same sense. I can't both be in my office and not be in my office at the exact same time. That's the issue with the law of non-contradiction. And so with contradictions, a contradiction is an explicit saying of opposites. Okay, sometimes we think things that are different are opposites. That's not the case, as we'll see in the next law of logic. So the next law of logic is actually the law of excluded middle. This is that either a proposition or a statement is true. We'll talk about what propositions or statements are, basically something that we can say that's true or false, or they're not. So that's why he says here at the beginning of this quotation from the Metaphysics, nor indeed can there be any intermediate between contrary statements, but of one thing we must either assert or deny one thing, whatever it may be. So for example, earlier I said today is Sunday. Now, if I take the law of identity, when I say Sunday, I mean Sunday and not something else. If I take the law of non-contradiction, it can't be the case that it's both Sunday and not Sunday. That would be a contradiction. Unless I mean something else, but maybe I'm looking at some other kind of calendar. Oh, it's technically not Sunday on the Gregorian versus some other calendar. But the law of excluded middle says either it's Sunday or it's not. So that's not the same thing as saying it's Sunday or it's Monday. Monday is a different day. Monday is not the opposite of Sunday. Because I could be, if I say Sunday or it's not, it could be Monday, it could be Tuesday, it could be Wednesday, it could be Thursday. There are 6 other options. Monday is not the opposite of Sunday. Tuesday is not the opposite of Sunday. What's the opposite of Sunday? Not Sunday. So the law of excluded middle says there's no middle ground between a statement. Either something's true or it's not. You've heard people say, what's going to happen when you go to the game this Sunday? Well, we'll win or we won't. Yep. Law of excluded middle. You might be thinking there, well, we tie. Well, if you tie, did you win? No. So there's a sense in which either you win or you don't, in terms of being the victor. Aristotle says there's not a middle ground. Now, some logicians, some scientists, some mathematicians object to this one the most. They say there's instances where this is not actually the case. I don't want to really get into that here. Simply, I want to say at this point, the law of excluded middle, the law of non-contradiction, the law of identity, Aristotle says, listen, to do any conversation you've ever had assumes these principles. I'm not just talking about doing work in math or work in logic. Anytime you've ever talked with anybody else about anything, you're assuming, so says Aristotle, all these principles, that when you're talking about something, you mean what you say, you don't believe that opposites are true, okay, explicit opposites, that's what I mean by contradictions there. All right, it's both, like we might say, I'm happy and sad, is that a contradiction? No. I'm happy and I'm not happy in the exact same way, that would be a contradiction. Okay, like I said, inconsistency is fine, contradictions are not. And law of excluded middle, something's either true or it isn't. Okay, there's no middle ground. That's what the law of excluded middle is. So for the sake of your first quiz, it's not that I want you to know the nuances of all these for the last 2,500 years. Just be able to recognize them. Which is to say, know that, when I say the law of identity, which one am I talking about? Am I talking about something is the same as itself? Am I talking about something cannot both be and not be at the same time in the same sense? Or am I talking about a proposition is true or its negation is true? So if you can at least identify the names with their technical definitions, you'll be good, but this is also basically to help you understand what's going on in logic. So that's the basic framework. according to Aristotle. Everything else rests on that.